It's my very great pleasure tonight to introduce you to our guest preacher, the Reverend Dr. Lord Lesley Griffiths. I am glad that we've got a wonderful congregation here for you who are in good voice, and we know that you will be in good voice. But we are honoured, sir, to have you share with us this evening. Lesley Griffiths is the Superintendent Minister of Wesley's Chapel in London for the past 18 years. Wesley's Chapel is sometimes called the Cathedral of World Methodism. It was built by the Reverend John Wesley in 1778 and is the place that Wesley based his ministry in the latter years of his long life, and where Wesley is buried. To add to the information that you already have on the back page of your order of service, Lesley was in Dunedin this past weekend as keynote speaker at the 2014 New Zealand Interfaith Forum. At lunchtime today, he spoke at Victoria University on coalition government, reflections on the UK coalition government. Tomorrow he will be welcomed at Parliament by members of the Labour caucus, and the Reverend Dr. David Clark MP of Dunedin has already been recognised here. And he will welcome Lesley tomorrow. Lesley flies to Christchurch for further meetings, then back to Dunedin for a Sunday morning service, and then he will top off his New Zealand visit with the annual Peace Lecture at the University of Otago, where his topic will be Believers of the World Unite. Sounds like a much needed rallying cry, given the multiple divisions that plague our world these days. Lesley is married to Margaret, who has her own career and is in London now, and they have 3 children, grown adult children. I think it appropriate that we all put our hands together to welcome Reverend Lesley Griffiths to this pulpit.
Well, my brothers and sisters, that sounded like my obituary, and I want to tell you that rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. I'm delighted to be with you here on this occasion and to share some thoughts with you. It's an honor for me to be here. And I bring you greetings, of course, from Wesley's Chapel in London, which was built by John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. And indeed, I can picture in my mind now the statue of James Cargill, who took Methodism to Fiji, John Hunt, who had a time in Tonga and in Fiji, John Waterhouse, who superintended the extension of Methodism into the South Pacific. And so we are very, very closely involved at Wesley's Chapel with the world family of Methodists, and it gives me great pleasure to be here this evening to see all of you as the evidence of the outworking of God's Holy Spirit in bringing Methodism to these parts of the world. It's my very first visit to New Zealand, I must say. Although as a Welshman, in my mind I have travelled here many times in order, in my mind, to defeat the All Blacks at rugby, something which actually on the field has yet to happen. So it's good to be here. And not to do anything highfalutin, but to share some rather basic thoughts, which I think will be as relevant here as they are in London. A rallying call indeed for all of us to remind us of the gospel that's been committed to us and that we are entrusted with in our own day. I did choose one reading and I've changed it, that's quite right. And I'm sorry about that if people had mugged up on it and were really looking forward to that one. I had to choose it months ahead, and well, a lot of other ideas have come into my head in the meantime. So here I am from Wesley's Chapel in London. I stand Sunday by Sunday in the very pulpit that John Wesley preached from, I sit on a campus there where John Wesley lived the last 12 years of his life, where he died, where he's buried. I am the guardian of the bones of John Wesley, so there you go. Sometimes I say very outrageous things, and I get letters from faithful Methodists saying, "Dr. Griffiths, how dare you say such things? John Wesley would be turning in his grave if he heard you." So I go out to the graveyard, I put my ear to the tomb, and since John Wesley seems entirely at peace, I'm able to form my reply and say, "Dear irascible from Tunbridge Wells, I want to draw to your attention the fact that John Wesley doesn't seem to be in the slightest bit concerned about what I said." So I'm in Matthew chapter 8. I just wonder if in New Zealand, as in Britain, we Christians have become so familiar with the core messages of the New Testament that we've lost the sense of their cutting edge, of just how radical they are, how challenging, how demanding. I think that that's true in London. I'd be surprised if a little bit of it isn't true here as well. Because in Matthew chapter 8, those three stories of Jesus meeting those three different people quite simply lay out in a very stark and radical way just what the Christian gospel is all about. And I want just to go through them quickly this evening with you. And perhaps just to remind all of us that the gospel that we proclaim, the Lord that we follow, is not some anodyne, some really rather undemanding and familiar sort of buddy who walks along the road with us, but somebody who actually asks of us that we respond to everything that he is and everything that he says in most challenging and demanding ways. Let me start with the encounter with the leper. Once upon a time, when I was growing up, the great Methodist missionary activity that we all rallied to was the leprosy mission. Now that, mercifully, is no longer the case. Leprosy is, largely speaking, dealt with. Yesterday's story. And anyway, we're not quite sure what the New Testament means by leprosy. It could mean one of a number of things. If you look in Leviticus chapter 13, you see the range of possibilities. The skin disease that is contagious, that could be quite simply a superficial thing, or something full-blown leprosy where if you catch it, the consequences are dire. But whichever it is, and by the way, if you want to get to sleep at night, I recommend that you read the book of Leviticus. It's a great way of getting off to sleep quickly. But in chapter 13, you have the range of possibilities, and whatever they are, whichever part of the spectrum of possibilities you look at, it is considered to be a contagious, infectious disease, and therefore those who don't have it must go nowhere near those who do. Keep your distance from people with these symptoms. That's the message. And of course, Jesus comes across a leper. In the worst possible cases, the leper is supposed to live outside the village, to ring a bell and to shout, "Unclean, unclean! Don't anyone come near me! I'm dirty. I'm dangerous." But Jesus comes across a leper and flouts convention and the law and associates with the leper. Not only does he do that, but he actually touches him. That was a very, very serious contravention. If you did it, you would have been reckoned to have been as unclean as the person you touched. Jesus keeps the company of unclean people. Jesus is not put off by those rules and regulations that keep him distant from another person. I've mentioned rugby, but let me mention cricket. I'm a cricketer of many, many years, and I know that the best kind of batsman is the batsman whose instinctive move when the ball is bowled at him at 90 miles an hour, or with some top spin at 50 miles an hour. I know that the best kind of batsman is the one whose instinct is to go onto the front foot to meet that ball, not to be afraid of it, to master the spin, to use the force of the ball that's being thrown at you to deflect it to the four corners of the field. Or you may have to go onto the back foot now and again, but the front foot is where you need to be, to pick out the line, to pick out the length. And Jesus is a front foot person when it comes to meeting people. He's into the meeting, instinctively. He doesn't pull back to say, hey, let me just ask a question or two about this person. Let me see how risk-averse I ought to be. Let me just work out the consequences of my getting too close to this. But he doesn't do that. The person comes, Jesus is into the meeting. I find it a very extraordinary piece of evidence of the way he behaved, and perhaps that we, his followers, should ourselves behave. So Jesus is into the meeting with a leper. Now, I know across my ministry who are the equivalent people to the lepers in the society where I have served. I think of the 10 years I was in Haiti. I think of the poor outcasts, the cripples, the people with incurable diseases, the people whose families rejected them in Haiti. I think of them, I can see them in my mind's eye now, and there they were, languishing at the edge of society. I can think of the 1980s in Britain when HIV/AIDS was becoming something that we were aware of, and how afraid we were of it. And how, therefore, the last thing we wanted to do was to have too close an association with anybody who suffered in that way. I worked with adult homeless people, street homeless people in London. Some of them were in a terrible mess, smelly, unwashed, and really in need of delousing. And frankly, one didn't instinctively go too near them either. I can think of all those people, social outcasts. I can think these days in political discourse in Britain why you'd think that the dirtiest, the most dangerous people in the world were immigrants. Because all political parties are saying the most horrendous things about immigrants, as if anybody strange who comes to your country is going to infect you with some strange disease if you're not careful. I've heard the language that isolates people, that marginalizes people. I know cases of people who are avoided. And in the experience I've had, I know that the challenge to me, a Christian, is if I am to be faithful to the example of Christ, how possible is it for me to go onto the front foot? How ready am I to move in the direction of the person who is an outcast? Now, I don't know anything about New Zealand society. I wouldn't stand here after 6 days' experience and tell you what it's like in New Zealand, but you know. You know who the people are that nobody wants to have any dealings with. You know who the people are who linger at the edges of society. You know the people that you'd hate your children to meet with because they might infect them with this, that, or the other. And I'm putting the challenge to you. As Jesus moved towards the leper and touched him, and therefore gave him his own well-being, put it at his disposal, are we ready to do the same thing? I remember a dear old lady in my congregation in London. She was a research assistant to a professor of history in the university. She was what we used to call a blue stocking. That is, a woman of learning, an independent woman whose scholarship and whose mental faculties were of the first order. She used to help us as a volunteer in our day center for homeless people. And she alone could deal with a man called Charlie. And Charlie was a mess. He was a real mess. He stank. And on one occasion, dear old Nora had been absent from church for about 3 weeks because she'd had the flu. And she came back one Sunday evening. She was normally a morning person. And she came that Sunday evening and she said, I'm trying to get my legs back together to work again, she said. I haven't been well. I'm trying a Sunday evening, and I'm hoping that I'll feel I can do it from now on. And then she saw Charlie in church. Oh no, she said, I'm just trying my legs out. I'm not ready for Charlie yet. And so I said, well, for this evening, Nora, go and sit somewhere else in the church. Just get yourself together. I went into the vestry to robe and to prepare for the service. And when I came back in to take the service, what did I see? Why should I be surprised? There was Nora, sitting next to Charlie, finding the pages in the hymn book for him, telling him to calm down when he got excited, because boy did he get excited. Not at anything the preacher said, but just because something was biting his head and he needed to scratch it and shout. So there is an example in this dear lady of a Christ-like deed. Now, it's a very radical thing that Jesus did with this leper. And I think that we, his followers, are expected to be radical in the way we form our relationships and serve our age as well. Then we go on to the meeting with the centurion. Well, there are several grounds upon which Jesus ought to have had nothing to do with him. The centurion was an officer in the Roman army. The Roman army was an army of occupation. It occupied Jesus' country. His people hated them, hated paying taxes to them, hated being subjugated to them. And Jesus should have just said politely, "Thank you, I'll see you tomorrow," or "Come back next week." Incidentally, a device that I've resorted to many times, I confess it, when I didn't think I could cope with the person who was coming my way. But here's the centurion, an officer in an army of occupation. Now, in Britain, during the Second World War, mercifully, because of the courage of our armed forces, our country was never invaded by the German army. But there were just 2 islands in the Channel Islands that lie between England and France that were occupied by the enemy army. Guernsey was one of them. In that little island, with the German soldiers in place on British soil, the local inhabitants kept their distance from the enemy army, except for some of the girls who rather liked some of the boys, and little flirtations began to happen. Once the fact that those girls were in a relationship with those boys became known, the rest of the community rose up against them. Those girls never found themselves part of the community again. They were outcasts because they associated with the enemy army. Now, I'm saying that the centurion should have got alarm bells ringing in the Jewish society of which Jesus was a part. Have something to do with him? He's the enemy. Why are you going near him? Don't listen to what he's asking you to do. But apart from that, there were other reasons too. The Roman centurion would, in all likelihood, have been a Caucasian, a white European man. Jesus was a Semite from the Middle East, a Semitic stock. So racially they had little to do with each other. Culturally, their hinterland of reference, their minds were full of different ways of thinking about things and approaching the realities of everyday life. But also, even beyond that, there was the question of religion. Jesus, a Jew, the one and only God who made the heavens and the earth, that's what Jews believed in. The Roman, coming from Rome, well, what did he believe? We don't know, it doesn't say, but one can imagine easily enough. In Rome, at the time Jesus was born, it was the reign of the Emperor Augustus. Augustus and other leaders of the Roman Empire were made gods. So you had in Roman mythology men being made gods. In the Christian economy, we know that God is not a self-aggrandizing reality, but a self-diminishing reality, as he expresses himself in human form and makes himself available in understandable and comprehensible ways to ordinary people. The Word became flesh and emptied himself of glory and majesty, humbled himself and became a slave. So religiously, if the Roman centurion started there, he was finding in Jesus something quite the opposite of what he knew in Rome. And then there was the polytheism of Rome. All those gods, worshipped here, there, and everywhere. Whereas in the Jewish religion, it was one God and one God only. Well, on all those grounds, the soldier in the army of occupation, of a different race and of a different religious background, Jesus might have said, "Hey, hold off, this is a bit too much for me." But did he? No, he didn't. Jesus had time for him also, on the front foot even for this man. So much so that the religious authorities gathered around, their jaws dropping, no doubt, to see what was happening. Well, they were full of criticism. Now, In the religious society of Jesus' day, there was a grumble committee. I don't suppose in New Zealand you ever have people who grumble. Certainly in the churches that I've belonged to, there's always a grumble subcommittee. I'd prefer it to be a subcommittee, although it seems to be accountable to no one. So there they were, Tut-Tut, the Tut-Tut brigade. What on earth is he doing talking to this man? Why is he dealing with this centurion? Doesn't he know? Jesus was very aware of that. And what he said to them as he turned on his heel is a reminder of just how radical this Jesus we follow is. Don't ever domesticate Jesus or think you can. Don't ever turn him into a nice, gentle kind of fellow who never asks awkward questions. This Jesus turned on his heel and said to these religious people, he said, if you want an example of faith, don't look to people in your community. This man is showing faith in its purest form. This man is an object lesson for you religious people who think that just because you're Jews, you'll go to heaven. And that is a challenge to all believers. Don't imagine that just because you go to church, you've got it all sorted out. Don't imagine that just because at a moment in your life you gave yourself to Christ, that is fine thereafter. You'll be judged by your deeds. And your deeds will be measured by your ability, by your readiness, by your instinctual behavior in the presence of people unlike yourselves, for whom you'll be expected to have time and to give place. Well, you know, as I know, that race and religion have often been cause for division in the world in which we live. I mean, I could point you to Northern Ireland, where a Roman Catholic church whose ideas were formed in the 19th century and who came to the conclusion that outside the church, that is the Roman Catholic Church, there was no salvation, was pitted against a Presbyterian church who, imbibing the doctrines of John Calvin about predestination, knew that they, the Presbyterians, were the chosen ones. So you had an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. And translate that into social and political terms, and you had the troubles that we knew only too well in Northern Ireland. Race, religion, they can be very divisive things indeed. One of the great things that I have gathered from my few days in New Zealand is the brilliant efforts that you're all making to live together across racial boundaries, and for the Maori language and culture to be given the validation and the place in the sun that it deserves, but for a while was marginalized and excluded from. So I just speak as the minister of a church whose congregation is drawn from 55 different nations, where we have 25 mother tongues other than English spoken by members of our congregation. And the great joy of seeing Sunday by Sunday as I come into church, the whole world in microcosm. There it is, all the breadth of cultures and experience, there it is in front of me. All people made in God's own image. Race and religion have too often been divisive, and in Jesus' eyes and by Jesus' example, there ain't no place for that kind of attitude. The followers of Christ are expected instinctually to be there for each other without asking the questions about where do you come from and what is your language and how do you think of things in your culture. And then Jesus moves on to Peter's mother-in-law. I always remind my Roman Catholic friends that the first pope was married. He had to be married if he had a mother-in-law. And therefore the precedent has been set, and there's no reason why we shouldn't have a few more popes who are married. I haven't gone that far in saying it yet, but perhaps before I die I will. But she was unwell, and she was unable to share the company of the people who come to her house. And every woman who runs a household knows that the one thing she doesn't want when there's company is not to be able to do what she has to do. I think in modern times we might want to write the script a little differently at this point, because we now know that women have for too long been kept in a subjugated place, given a diminished role, and that they are members of the human race just as well as anybody else. I mean, in the churches I've served, I can think of the finance committee and the property committee, 95% filled by men. The family committee, women. Well, it's got to stop. Women can run property better than men half the time. The other half time they can't. Just wanted to be clear about that. But we've got to destroy this stereotyping of people. According to their gifts, let them serve. Not according to their gender or according to their race or whatever it is. So Peter's mother-in-law is released from the fever that limits her abilities and is released back into the mainstream of activity. And we know that the church has been a patriarchal society down the ages, and we know that that's not right. And Jesus, in his activity, even though he was a practicing Jew, and so many practicing Jews began the day with a prayer, the men thanking God that they were not born women. And if there was anything of that around, Jesus showed no evidence of seeing things that way. So I think that we've got to follow Jesus at that point too. Well, now, there's the encounters. There's the front foot Jesus. There's the man moving into the meeting. There's the man not waiting to assess whether he should or whether he shouldn't, balancing the factors. I just think this man's great. And you know, as I think about it, an image comes into my mind. When I get back to England next week, we'll be on the eve of the Commonwealth Games. Now that I've been to New Zealand, I shall, as appropriate, cheer for the New Zealand athletes in the hope that they win a thing or two. Not when they're up against Welsh runners, let me tell you, but there's just so far you can go with this charity thing. But the Commonwealth Games, and I think of the 100 meters hurdles event. 8 rows of hurdles, you've got 100 meters, you've got to jump over all of them, and then you've got to beat all your opponents. I think of Jesus on the starting line, all those hurdles ahead of him, all the things that separate people from each other, all the things that we've done in our social history down the ages to erect barriers that keep people apart from each other. There they are all ahead of him. And it's on your marks. Get set. Go. The pistol is fired. And off he goes. He doesn't even attempt to clear the hurdles. He runs through them, one after another. Social class, politics, religion, race, gender, and I would add, on the balance of probability, sexual orientation too. Knocks them all down and wins the race. That's our Jesus. Things that we set up to keep people in their place. Barriers we create in order to herd people according to our prejudices are as nothing when Jesus faces them. He simply rushes through them because in his eyes they count for nothing. Now, that's where my sermon should finish. I was taught at theological college, the 3 sermons, three points of what you have in a sermon. Number 1, number 2, number 3, that's the best you can hope for from your congregations, but if your congregations look lively, you can give them a 4th. So my judgment is that you look extraordinarily lively, and you're going to get a 4th. You can vote on it if you like, but you're going to get it anyway. I'm going to say to you the most challenging thing. There is this Jesus as I've described him. There he is, challenging the conventions, the social machinery that we erect to protect ourselves from the undue influence of people we don't want to meet. There we are, and there he is telling us what to do about it. And all that in Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 to 17, which follow Matthew chapters 5 to 7. Matthew chapters 5 to 7, the Sermon on the Mount. Now, that is, for Methodists, the center of gravity of the New Testament theology that they try to live by. It certainly was in the teaching of John Wesley. When I was training to be a local preacher about, in the year that King Uzziah died, when I was training to be a local preacher, I remember we had to know about the 44 sermons of John Wesley. 13 of the 44 sermons were on texts from the Sermon on the Mount. So it's pretty important, this Sermon on the Mount. And it's important to say that these outworkings of Jesus' teaching that we've been talking about tonight in chapter 8 follow from the teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. In other words, Jesus preaches it, and then he does it. Jesus says it, and then he puts it into practice. You can't put a razor blade between what Jesus says and what he does. The integrity of Jesus is total. He doesn't say it and then forget that he said it. He says it and he does it. He's as good as his word. This is God's word made flesh. I say that because we live in an age where the gap between what people say and what they do gets bigger and bigger. In the world of advertising, you see all the claims that are made for a product. When you go and buy it, it's not like that at all. I mean, when Margaret, my wife, and I went on honeymoon, I bought a cookery book. I was fully intending to be a modern man. But I chose a rather ambitious menu. The photograph of what I should have produced looked simply wonderful. But it didn't turn out like it. Looked like a flattened cow pat when I'd finished with it. I did my best. But we all know that the claims made for a product, the claims made by people in public life, this is what we'll give you, vote for us. And then when they deliver, it isn't like that at all. Now, I think that Jesus is an object lesson in making his bid in a sermon. Turn the other cheek, go the second mile. God loves the peacemakers, those who thirst after righteousness, the pure in heart, and all the rest of it. He says all those wonderful things. And then he does them. He delivers. I can't be anything other than obsessed with this man who manages to do what he says, to be what he proclaims. And I just hope that the gap between what I say and what I do gets smaller and smaller as I think more and more about him. So that's my challenge tonight. All for Jesus. All for Jesus. Everyone for Jesus. And we should follow him and be like him. And if we manage to do that, what a difference we'd make to the world. How lovely to see you all. God bless you.